Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'd like to give you guys an update of my Paulownia trees here. So I'll give you a quick overview of what's been happening for the last year and just give you a bit of history of these plants before I show you how they're doing now. So these were actually grown about a year ago. So in 2020 springtime I sowed a load of Paulownia seeds. Now these seeds were labelled as Paulownia hybrid Paulownias, which are supposed to be a really hardy hybrid, one of the most cold tolerant ones, and is also one of the fastest growing varieties as well. So these are basically the fastest growing trees in the world at the moment, and they're also supposed to be hardy to minus 33 degrees Celsius, so incredibly hardy type of Paulownia. But what I think I actually ended up with is, instead of the F1 hybrid, so the idea with hybrid seeds is that you have two parent plants which aren't closely related, often a different species but not always. What happens when you cross the two parents is you get what's called hybrid vigor with the descendants. So the new generation that you produce, they're all pretty much uniform because all the recessive genes from the plants get suppressed and all the dominant genes get expressed. So all the plants should be uniform in size and shape and the growth habit, pretty much all showing similar genetics, and then what you should have is a really strong healthy plant. Now if you get those hybrid plants and then you cross-pollinate them again and you collect the seeds from that, instead of having an F1 hybrid you have what you call an F2 hybrid, and instead of everything being uniform with similar genes being expressed, you have a real mixture and basically every single plant looks different. So I was expecting F1 hybrid seeds, and that's what the seeds were labelled as, but what I think I have is F2 hybrid seeds. So the parents of these plants were actually an F1 hybrid Paulownia, and what I have here is an F2 generation of Paulownias, and so every single one has grown very differently, all with different characteristics. And I'll put up on the screen the different parents that this original hybrid is supposed to come from. I think it's 3 different types of Paulownia species, so there's loads of different genes mixed in here, and so they're all just coming randomly out as the seeds have germinated. So each one has pretty different genetics. So what I'm going to do now is I'll pick up the camera, I'll go through them all, maybe not every single one, but most of them individually, show you how they're doing, and then I'll show you the one I planted in the ground last year and show you how that's doing, because that was the best one genetically anyway for what I'm looking for, which was giant leaves and rapid growth. And because it's been in the soil, it's done a lot better as well because it's had more root base. So all these have been grown in very similar environment. The smaller ones, which generally the ones in the smaller pots, but actually there's a couple on this right hand side here which are in bigger pots and they're still quite small. These were planted out slightly later from the tray of seeds, so that's why they're a bit smaller, but it doesn't mean that they're necessarily smaller plants. It's just that they're in smaller pots and they were planted on later in the year, last year. These have all gone through the winter. These have been hit by frost in varying degrees. Some of them have come out just fine, other ones are struggling. So I'll show you them individually now and show you how they're doing. So as I was saying, there's a lot of variation with these plants, and you can see that a lot with the leaf shape. So some of them are quite crinkly and jaggedy on the leaves, and I'll go over, there's one here which has particularly small leaves. So although this is quite a big plant, the leaves are quite small. They almost look like a maple with the points here, and as well as having big points, they also have very small serrations along the edge of the leaf. So you can see on the leaf margin there, lots of small serrations, and so it looks quite different to some of the other ones. This one here is similar. The leaves do vary a lot on the individual plant, so there is a bit of variability on the plant itself, but you can still tell with the genetics that there is some difference here. So this one, instead of having 3 main lobes, it has quite a few other ones, and some of them are quite pointy, especially when you can see this one here. We got some really quite pointy sections on the leaves. Other ones are a lot smoother. So this one, for example, the leaves are quite smooth. They don't have those small serrations on the edge of the leaf, and the leaf itself only has really that one point at the end, and it's a lot more elongated. Then there's some that are in between the two there, other ones which have much more rounded leaves, and then it's basically just a variation in all of them. And some of them, as I say, have got these much smaller leaves and they're just more finely serrated on the edges. Other ones are a lot smoother. So there's quite a bit of variation there. Some of them as well have particularly long leaves, such as these two here. These have really long leaves, so they're probably taking different characteristics from the different parent plants. I think this one comes from 3 different species that have been crossed and hybridized, so there's, as I say, there's quite a lot of genetic variation. Some of them will look more like one species than the other, but they'll all kind of look like a mixture of the lot. It just depends which genes are expressed more than others, and that's why some have got a serrated edge, some of them are smooth, other ones are round, other ones are long-leafed, so they're all quite different in that characteristic. One particularly strange characteristic I found was that Paulownia trees aren't supposed to flower until they're mature plants. I had 2 that had flower buds this year and 1 that actually went into flower. So at the end of last summer, a couple of them started to form flower buds, and one of them actually opened and came fully into flower. So I'll show you what the flower buds look like, because one of them still has some flower buds on it. That's this one over here. So this one, as you can see, there are actually a few flower buds on the top there. These never fully developed. They did survive the whole winter, but they didn't actually open in spring. I think there was actually a third one that also had flower buds, but they fell off in the winter with the frost. But there was this one at the end, and it's interesting to see, although they both are flowering, those ones, the leaf shape on that is very different to the leaf shape on this. I'd say they shouldn't normally flower at such a young age. These were flowering in less than a year of age. So this one here, you can't see any flowers now, but there was some lovely flowers on there. I'll show you some photos, and at the end of this video I've also recorded a time lapse of this actual plant growing and the flowers coming out, so you can see how the flowers form and how they develop. But this one, as I say, flowered nicely, so this one I'm definitely going to keep. Basically with these plants, the ones with the nicest characteristics I'll keep and maybe grow in my garden if I have space. This one, because it flowers from such a young age, I think this will be really good as a small flowering tree, so I'm going to be keeping this one. I might plant it permanently somewhere, but it's also quite nice because it's got those kind of spiky leaves and it flowers so young, so that's really quite a nice one. And I'll see if any other ones decide to start flowering this autumn, as the flowers, they start to form in the autumn time. They last all winter just as buds, and then in springtime they open and actually come into full flowering. So the other differences we've seen with this, so I've gone through leaf shape and flowering, there's a few colour differences. So a lot of them have more of a purple tinge to the new leaves. It's not showing up as much as it was in spring. I think the colder temperatures kind of make it more prominent. You can see there's a slight purpley tinge there. This one as well. Some of them don't have it at all, they're just more of a light colour. Other ones are more purpley, so there's quite a bit of variation there. You can actually see this one here. It's quite a purpley colour. And I must add, these were all grown in a very similar environment. They're all right next to each other. So the frost tolerance and the growth form is more genetically determined, with the exception of the smaller pots, which has stunted some of the plants. But all the reaction to the plants, it hasn't been the environment, it's been the genetics, because they've all been under pretty much the same growing regime. So there's also been a big tolerance difference in the roots rotting in the winter, and also with the frost damage. So most of these actually came through without any frost damage whatsoever. You can see particularly the ones at the back, which are the tallest ones, didn't get any frost damage, they were absolutely fine. Some of them got minor frost damage, so we've got this one down here for example. As you can see, it lost half the top of the stem and it kind of resprouted from the bottom. This one as well, it lost just the very tip, but generally it's fine. But there was others like this one here, which basically lost the whole stem due to frost damage. It died all the way down to the bottom. This one as well, almost died to the bottom and resprouted. Now none of them have died, but there are a few that have suffered quite a bit, as you can see, with the frost damage taking them back. And this one in particular, this was interesting. This wasn't frost damage, this was actually the roots rotting. So you can see here, this stem is actually still alive, and there is a little shoot coming out there on that bud. And this rest of this bark looks like it's still alive as well. So I don't think this is frost damage, and it's just starting to regrow, but it's really struggling. So I had a look at the roots on this. This one, it actually seems to me to be root damage. So I did take this out earlier, but basically there's not a lot of roots. It looks like most of the roots are rotted off. You can see how it's just kind of pulling out there, not all the soil's coming out, it's kind of coming out separately. So this one, for whatever reason, it's less tolerant of wet soil in winter, and the roots have died off from that, and so it's really struggling to grow now. Although most of the roots died, the lignotuber, which is a specialist part of the plant, it's a tuber basically at the base of the plant where it can store energy, so it responds well to wildfires and if it's cut back. That's why Paulownia trees grow so vigorously once they've been pollarded. But basically that survived, but the roots didn't, so it's just re-establishing its roots, so it's taking a little bit of time at the moment. So these plants, as I say, it's interesting to see the differences. The differences, I don't know if we'll see any more as they develop. The only difference I'll probably look at in the years to come is their reaction to pollarding. So some might grow more vigorously than others when pollarded. Some of them might just grow slowly after pollarding, but most should respond quite vigorously with that lignotuber. It'll be interesting to see how they do. So I'll probably grow them for another year or two, maybe next year or the end of this year. I'll cut them down to the ground, let them resprout as a pollard, see how fast they grow. And with the ones that are showing signs of flowering, I'll probably keep them, maybe try and grow them as a small flowering tree. But they're all doing quite well. Now, they won't be growing anywhere near as fast as they could be, because I'm in North Scotland Temperatures here, they don't go above 20 degrees Celsius very often in summer. The average warmest temperature in midsummer is actually 18 degrees Celsius, so we don't get very warm summers. And Paulownia trees don't grow at their best unless they're really well above 20 degrees Celsius. They like the temperatures in the high 20s, low 30s. They are almost a subtropical tree, so to get maximum growth you need to have them in a hot country. So these will never grow as fast as they could do. These could easily grow 4 to 5 meters in 1 year. But here in Scotland they will struggle a bit. At least these are hardy, these ones, so they'll survive the winters, but in the summers they'll just be a bit slower than they could be. Although it is interesting to see that each one, or at least most of them, have grown as much as they did last year, and in some cases they've grown more. So you can see this one here, the amount of growth it's put on there is about equal to how much growth it had put on the whole of last year, and this has only just really appeared in the last month or so. So the growth, although it's a bit slower than it would be in a warmer climate, it's still quite rapid. And it'll be interesting to see how big these grow. So in the first year when I grew these, which was only last year, the growth was a bit disappointing. Basically, it didn't seem to matter if they were in a big pot or a small pot. The small pot ones, they were just slightly thinner stems, they weren't any taller. What seemed to happen is they grew until about June or July, and then they stopped growing, didn't grow for the rest of the summer, and I think they were putting all their energy into their lignotuber and building up an energy reserve, and then it just lost to the leaves, so they didn't really, as I say, grow much height. The one in the ground grew a thicker stem, and the bigger pot ones grew thicker stems, but they're all pretty much exactly the same height of around 30 centimeters or 1 foot. And so I think this year it'll be interesting to see how much of a difference it's made with the lignotuber, and maybe once it's developed in the first year, it will then put more of its energy into growing for the whole summer. So it'll be interesting to see if these stop growing around about the same time as they did last year, which will probably be around this time, to be honest, or if they'll just keep growing the whole summer and be massive plants by the end of summer. I'm not sure how they'll do, but it'll be interesting to see. And certainly if I did pollard them, I find with most pollarded plants they tend to grow throughout the whole summer. So with other pollarded trees here in Scotland, such as willows, if you let them grow just normally, they'll probably grow until about July and then stop growing and then go deciduous in autumn. But if you pollard them, they tend to grow very rapidly and they'll continue growing right up until the frost. So I'll quickly show you my one in the ground and show you how that's doing. So this is my best Paulownia tree. This is the one that when I grew all of the ones from seeds, this was really an outlier. For some reason it just seemed to grow a lot faster than the other ones, and the leaves were much larger as well. So I took this one out and separated it earlier on than the others, and I planted this straight in my garden around about the same time that I put all the other ones in their final pots. So this one grew a lot better last summer. The leaves were much bigger. I'll show you some photos of how it looked. Interestingly, the leaves are a bit narrower this year, so there's a lot of variability year to year with the leaf shape. But I've noticed with the other ones as well, the first leaves tend to be a bit narrower and elongated, and you can see this down on some of these stems here and with this leaf here. But then as they grow they seem to get wider and they get more of their kind of final big kind of like dustbin lid kind of shaped round leaves eventually. So this one, as I say, grew well last summer. It did the same thing. It only grew to 1 foot high. It had big leaves. It grew a nice thick stem. As you can see, this is much thicker than the other ones, but it only grew 1 foot in height. It put all that energy into the stem, into the lignotuber, and not into any height. So this year it started to shoot away. This one, luckily, as well as being the fastest growing, is also one of the hardier ones. There was only a couple of centimeters that died off at the top there. Now, we didn't have a hard winter last winter. I think -7 or -6 was about the hardest we got, but we can get down to -15, so hopefully this will be absolutely fine even in those conditions. But this one, as you can see, has actually grown about as much height this year as it had the whole of last summer, and it's growing 3 main stems, which I will allow to keep growing its 3 main stems. I'll probably grow this for 2 or 3 years, get it into a small tree, and then I'll cut it down to the ground, let it regrow as a coppice, and that's when I'll just narrow it down to 1 shoot and I'll grow it for its enormous leaves. And I won't know the full potential of how big these leaves can get until I do cut them down, because it's when they grow back from a coppice that they get the giant leaves. So I won't know until I do that how big the leaves can potentially get on these plants, which is another reason why I want to grow them all for a bit longer, coppice them all, and see if there's much difference in the genetics with how big the leaves are when they're coppiced. So as I say, this one's doing well. This one still has quite a lot of that purplish colour in the leaves, a lot more than the other ones actually, which is quite nice to see. Gives it a bit more interest having the leaves changing colour. So this one should do well this year. Should grow much bigger than the rest because genetically it seems to be predetermined to do that. But also it's in the ground, it's got loads of space for its roots. I've made this really rich soil and I've given it lots of feed, so this should really romp away and grow really quite big this summer. I'm expecting this to grow to about 2 meters in height, maybe 3, but we'll see. If it does what it did last year and stop growing halfway through the summer, then it's not going to reach that height. But if it continues to grow all summer long, then this could easily be 2 or 3 meters by the end of summer. So that's all for this Paulownia tree update video. I'll probably see you guys either at the end of summer if these have put on a lot of growth. If I don't do a dedicated Paulownia tree video at the end of summer, you'll definitely see the one planted in the ground at some point on my garden tour or my tropical bed tour towards the end of summertime, when it should be at its full height. These plants I'll definitely give you guys an update probably next spring for sure, possibly at the end of summer if there's something interesting that's happening with them. And I'll probably be pollarding them next year to see if we get any giant leaves with the regrown pollarded growth. And we'll see how they're doing with the roots at the moment. They seem to have lost a lot of their roots and they're regrowing them, so they're not pot bound at the moment, but I'll see how the roots are forming and I'll probably repot them this year if they look like they do need to be repotted. So that's all for this video, and I'll see you guys later in the year with some further updates on these Paulownia trees.